Welcome, brave souls, to another chilling tale from the Nightmare Maestro. Tonight, we journey to a small town carnival on its last legs, where the creaks and groans of a newly renovated Ferris will herald a descent into terror. What dark secrets lurk beneath the faded paint and forced gaiety? Strap in, dear listeners, for a ride you'll never forget if you survive. The Starlight Carnival had seen better days. Once a beacon of summer joy, it now stood as a tattered remnant of bygone glory. Faded banners fluttered weakly in the evening breeze, their once vibrant colors bleached by years of sun and neglect. The air hung heavy with the cloying scent of stale popcorn and the metallic tang of rust. At the center of this decaying wonderland loomed the grand wheel, freshly painted but unable to mask years of neglect. Its massive form dominated the skyline, a titan among the sagging tents and creaking rides. As dusk fell, the wheel's lights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the nearly empty midway. The bulbs buzzed and sputtered, some refusing to illuminate at all, leaving gaps in the wheel's outline like missing teeth in a forced smile. Frank Holloway, the carnival's veteran ride operator, squinted at the grand wheel with a mixture of pride and unease. His weathered face, etched with lines born of both laughter and worry, reflected the wheel's lights as he approached. He'd poured his heart into its renovation, a last-ditch effort to save the struggling carnival. Every spare dollar and moment had gone into replacing rusted bolts, reinforcing worn struts, and patching the peeling paint. But something felt off. The wheel's usual gentle hum had taken on a discordant note, like a whisper of dread carried on the evening breeze. Frank's calloused hands, stained with grease and paint, clenched involuntarily at his sides. He'd worked these fairgrounds for over 3 decades, knew every creak and groan of the aging attractions. This sound, this was new, and in Frank's experience, new was rarely good. Shaking off his paranoia, Frank began his nightly inspection. His feet traced the familiar path around the wheel's base, eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. The ticket booth stood empty, a layer of dust on the counter speaking to the carnival's dwindling attendance. Frank sighed, remembering summers past when families had lined up eagerly for a chance to touch the sky. As he neared the loading platform, Frank's hand brushed against the control panel. A spark jumped between his fingers and the metal, sharp and unexpected. He jerked back, cursing under his breath. Static electricity, he told himself. Just the dry air. But the hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention, a primal warning system triggered by something his conscious mind couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Morning brought with it a chill that seemed to seep into Frank's bones. He stood at the carnival entrance, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn jacket, watching as a sleek car pulled into the potholed parking lot. The vehicle looked comically out of place among the weathered trucks and rusty vans that belonged to the carnival workers. Its polished surface reflected the weak sunlight, a stark contrast to the faded glory surrounding it. Out stepped Meredith Chen, the county's no-nonsense safety inspector. Her crisp pantsuit and immaculate hair were as out of place in the carnival as her car. She moved with purpose, each step precise and measured. A clipboard was clutched in one hand, a tablet in the other, modern tools of assessment in a place that time seemed to have forgotten. Meredith's sharp eyes took in the carnival's faded splendor with barely concealed disdain. Her gaze swept over peeling paint, sagging banners, and the ominous silhouette of the grand wheel looming in the background. Her lips pursed, as if she'd tasted something unpleasant. Frank could almost see the violations tallying up in her mind. Her heels clicked a staccato rhythm as she approached Frank, the sound unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. No cheerful carnival music played yet. The grounds were still and lifeless, holding their breath in anticipation of the inspection to come. Frank forced a smile, extending a hand that Meredith pointedly ignored. Her eyes were already on her clipboard, scanning through a checklist of regulations and potential infractions. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her tone clipped and professional. "I trust you have all the necessary documentation ready for review." Without waiting for an answer, she began walking towards the carnival proper, leaving Frank to hurry after her. As they made their way to the grand wheel, Frank couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced nervously at the silent attractions they passed. The merry-go-round horses seemed to leer at him, their painted eyes following his progress. The funhouse mirrors reflected distorted versions of reality, images twisting in ways that defied logic. Even the cheerful cartoon characters adorning the game booths seemed sinister in the harsh light of day, their smiles too wide, their eyes too knowing. Meredith's voice cut through his unease, all business as she rattled off a list of regulations and potential violations. Load-bearing capacity, emergency stop mechanisms, passenger restraint systems. She ticked off items on her tablet, her frown deepening with each notation. Meredith's skepticism was palpable as she meticulously examined every bolt and bearing of the grand wheel. Her frown deepened with each notation on her clipboard, each tap on her tablet's screen. Frank hovered nearby, alternating between holding his breath and offering up silent prayers to whatever higher power might be listening. Frank's attempts to explain the wheel's recent upgrades fell on deaf ears. He spoke of new paint specially formulated to resist rust, of reinforced struts and updated safety harnesses. But his words seemed to evaporate in the cool morning air, unheard or dismissed by the stern-faced inspector. "Mr. Holloway," Meredith interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm not interested in cosmetic improvements. This carnival has a history of safety violations. My job is to ensure that no corners have been cut in the name of nostalgia." She spat the last word as if it were a curse. Just as Meredith opened her mouth to deliver what Frank feared would be a damning verdict, a ear-splitting screech of metal on metal pierced the air. Both inspector and operator whirled to face the wheel, which now swayed ominously despite the lack of wind. The sound echoed across the carnival grounds, setting off a chorus of car alarms in the distant parking lot. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, unnaturally, one of the wheel's carriages began to turn. Its movement was jerky, resisting the laws of physics and the constraints of its mechanical design. As Frank and Meredith watched in horror, the carriage completed a full rotation, independent of the wheel itself. Meredith's clipboard clattered to the ground, her professional demeanor momentarily shattered. That's impossible," she muttered, her analytical mind struggling to process what she had seen. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose, a nervous habit that betrayed her unease. The gravitational and mechanical forces required to move a single carriage like that. It simply can't happen. Frank nodded vigorously, latching onto her logical explanation like a lifeline. "Exactly. It must have been a trick of the light, or maybe a gust of wind we didn't feel down here." But even as he spoke, he knew his words were empty. The stillness of the air and the lingering echo of screeching metal told a different story. Steeling herself, Meredith insisted on a full demonstration of the wheel's operation. Her voice trembled slightly as she made the request, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to mask with professionalism. Frank hesitated, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. The thought of approaching the wheel again, let alone setting it in motion, sent a shiver of dread through him. But with his livelihood on the line, he had no choice. As night fell, an eerie silence descended upon the Starlight Carnival. The usual sounds of laughter and music had been replaced by the low moans of the wind as it wound its way through the twisted metal structures. The grand wheel stood silent and still, a looming presence that seemed to watch over the deserted grounds with malevolent intent. Frank found himself drawn back to the wheel, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The day's events had left him shaken, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. As he approached, the air grew thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere was trying to push him away. Suddenly, a gust of wind cut through the fog, and Frank found himself being pulled towards the wheel by an unseen force. He scrambled for purchase on the damp ground, but it was futile. His feet left the earth, and he was yanked upward, a scream dying in his throat as he was forcibly strapped into the lead carriage. The wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The world outside became a blur of shadow and faint light, the carnival grounds shrinking away beneath him. Frank's knuckles turned white as he gripped the safety bar, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As the carriage reached the apex of its rotation, time seemed to stand still. Frank hung suspended between earth and sky, the stars above him suddenly too bright, too close. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy, and he became aware of a presence beside him. Turning his head slowly, dreading what he might see, Frank found himself face to face with a being of shadow and mist. Its form was constantly shifting, never quite settling into a recognizable shape. But its eyes were fixed on Frank, ancient and hungry. The shadowy figure leaned in close, its voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome, Frank Holloway," it hissed, its breath cold against his ear. "We've been waiting for you. For so long, we've slumbered, fed by the small fears and disappointments of your pitiful carnival. But now, oh now, we feast." It spoke of ancient bargains and sacrifices, of a hunger that could never be sated. Frank listened, unable to move, unable to even blink, as the creature laid bare the terrible truth. The grand wheel was more than just a ride. It was a doorway, a threshold between worlds. And Frank, with his years of dedication and care, had been unknowingly preparing it for this moment. As the carriage began its descent, Frank caught a glimpse of the carnival far below. It looked different now, twisted and wrong, as if seen through a shattered mirror. He realized with a sinking heart that this nightmare was far from over for him, for the carnival, for the entire town that slumbered unknowingly in the shadow of the awakened wheel. Dawn broke over the Starlight Carnival, painting the sky in sickly hues of yellow and gray. Meredith Chen sat in her car, dark circles under her eyes betraying a sleepless night. She'd waited for Frank to return, growing increasingly uneasy as the hours ticked by. Now, as the first weak rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, she steeled herself to face whatever horrors the new day might bring. Stepping out of her vehicle, Meredith was immediately struck by the oppressive silence. No birds sang, no early morning workers called out greetings. Even the ever-present hum of distant traffic was absent. It was as if the carnival existed in a bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. As she approached the grand wheel, Meredith saw a figure slumped at its base. Her heart leapt into her throat as she recognized Frank's worn jacket. She rushed forward, her heels sinking into the dew-damp grass, all thoughts of professional detachment forgotten. "Frank? Frank, can you hear me?" She shook his shoulder gently, then more urgently when he failed to respond. Slowly, painfully, Frank's eyes fluttered open. But the gaze that met Meredith's was not the one she remembered. There was something old in those eyes now, something that had seen things no human was meant to witness. "They're hungry," Frank whispered, his voice hoarse and cracked. "They've always been hungry, but now they're awake. And we've been feeding them all along." He gripped Meredith's arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging into her flesh. "The wheel, it's not just a ride, it's a door, and we've opened it." Meredith tried to make sense of Frank's ramblings, her logical mind rebelling against the implications of his words. But as she opened her mouth to question him further, a low moan echoed across the grounds. It started soft, barely audible, but quickly grew in volume and intensity. Frank's eyes widened in terror. "They're coming," he breathed, struggling to his feet. "We have to go. Now." But it was too late. The moaning rose to a keening wail that set their teeth on edge. The air itself seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. And through the morning mist, Meredith saw shapes moving twisted, impossible shapes that hurt her eyes to look at directly. The grand wheel groaned to life, its massive form shuddering as it began to turn. Each carriage that passed seemed to contain shadowy figures, their hollow eyes fixed on the two humans who stood frozen in terror at the wheel's base. As panic threatened to overwhelm her, Meredith felt a tug on her arm. Frank was pulling her away, his face a mask of grim determination. "There's something we need," he said, his voice barely audible over the wheel's unearthly keening. "My grandfather, he left something, a failsafe. It might be our only chance." Together, they ran through the fog-shrouded carnival, the wails of the awakened wheel growing louder with each step. Meredith's analytical mind struggled to process what was happening, but one thing was clear: the nightmarish ride they had embarked upon was far from over. Frank led Meredith through the maze of dilapidated attractions, his steps sure despite his obvious exhaustion. They arrived at a rusted maintenance shed, its door hanging askew on corroded hinges. Frank fumbled with a ring of keys, his hands shaking as he tried key after key. Come on," he muttered, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. The wailing of the grand wheel had subsided to a low, ominous hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath their feet. Finally, the lock gave way with a reluctant groan. Inside, the shed was a cluttered mess of old tools, spare parts, and memories of better days. Frank pushed aside layers of junk, sending up clouds of dust that made them both cough. "Here," he said at last, pulling out a small, ornate box. "My grandfather's. He was one of the carnival's founders. Said this was its heart, its soul. I always thought he was being sentimental, but now." He pried open the box, revealing a single, ancient-looking gear. Its surface was etched with symbols Meredith didn't recognize, twisting, eldritch shapes that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of the eye. As Frank lifted it, the gear seemed to pulse with an inner light, casting strange shadows across their faces. "A counterweight," Meredith breathed, understanding dawning on her face. "Something to balance out whatever's powering that thing." She gestured towards the grand wheel, which now towered impossibly high, its upper reaches lost in roiling storm clouds that had gathered out of nowhere. A crash from outside made them both jump. Through the shed's grimy window, they saw one of the carnival's smaller rides, a children's carousel, begin to twist and deform. The painted horses stretched and warped, their once cheerful faces contorting into silent screams. "It's spreading," Frank said, his voice hollow. "The wheel was just the beginning, if we don't stop it now." He didn't need to finish the thought. Meredith nodded grimly, her skepticism long since shattered by the horrors she'd witnessed. "What do we need to do?" Frank clutched the gear tightly, its ethereal glow seeping between his fingers. "We have to get it to the heart of the wheel. It's the only way to close the door." As they stepped out of the shed, the full extent of the carnival's transformation became apparent. Rides groaned and twisted, their metal frames bending in ways that defied physics. The very ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was awakening to some eldritch rhythm. And at the center of it all, the grand wheel spun faster and faster, its form now more spiral than circle, reaching up into the storm-dark sky like a skeletal hand clawing at the heavens. Frank and Meredith exchanged a look, no words necessary to convey the gravity of their task. With grim determination, they set off towards the wheel, knowing that every step brought them closer to either salvation or damnation. The journey to the grand wheel was a nightmare of twisted metal and writhing shadows. What had once been familiar carnival attractions were now monstrous parodies of themselves. The funhouse mirrors reflected impossible geometries, and the cotton candy machine spun webs of something dark and sticky that pulsed with unholy life. Frank and Meredith pushed on, the gear's soft glow their only comfort in the encroaching darkness. As they neared the wheel, the air grew thick and resistant, as if reality itself was trying to keep them away. The grand wheel had become a whirling vortex of metal and shadow, consuming everything in its path. Trailers were crushed like tin cans, their contents sucked into the maelstrom. The very fabric of reality seemed to warp around the wheel's epicenter, colors bleeding into one another in ways that hurt the eyes to witness. "How are we supposed to get near that thing?" Meredith shouted over the howling wind, her hair whipping wildly around her face. Frank's response was lost as a section of fence was torn from the ground, narrowly missing them as it flew past. They pressed on, leaning into the gale, each step a battle against forces that didn't belong in this world. As they reached the base of the wheel, Frank stumbled, nearly falling into the wheel's maw. Meredith grabbed him, her fingers digging into his arm. For a moment, they locked eyes, a lifetime of understanding passing between them. They both knew that what they were about to do might well cost them everything. "Together," Frank shouted, holding up the gear. Meredith nodded, placing her hand over his. As one, they thrust the gear towards the heart of the vortex. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a sound like the universe tearing apart filled the air. The wheel's rotation slowed, then reversed, spinning faster and faster in the opposite direction. Light erupted from every seam and rivet, blinding in its intensity. Frank and Meredith clung to each other as reality seemed to fold in on itself. The gear pulsed between them, growing hotter and brighter until it was painful to touch. Yet they held on, knowing that to let go now would mean the end of everything. With a final, earth-shattering boom, the light exploded outward. Frank felt Meredith's hand slip from his as the shockwave hit, and then silence. When Meredith's vision cleared, the carnival lay in ruins. Where the grand wheel had stood was nothing but a smoking crater. Of Frank, there was no sign. She called his name, her voice hoarse and barely audible above the ringing in her ears. But only silence answered. As sirens wailed in the distance, Meredith sank to her knees in the debris-strewn dirt. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her core, that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only changed form. The entity that had inhabited the grand wheel was ancient, patient. It would find new vessels, new feeding grounds. In the years that followed, Meredith would dedicate her life to tracking down other cursed attractions, always one step behind the entity that had escaped the grand wheel's destruction. She became a watchful guardian, a lone sentinel against horrors that lurked in the shadows of forgotten amusement parks and abandoned fairgrounds. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered just right, she could still hear the creak of metal and the echoes of unearthly laughter. For in the world of cursed carnivals and malevolent machines, the ride never truly ends. It simply waits for its next victim. In the realm of forgotten dreams and twisted metal, every ticket is one way, and the carnival never truly closes. It merely waits, hungry and patient, for the next unwary soul to step through its gates. Subscribe for more chilling tales from the Nightmare Maestro.